Okay, we left off talking about the failed alliance between Great Britain and the Nazis after the invasion of Poland. Any questions about Hitler breaking the Munich Pact and the naval agreement with the British? I told you we're going to dig into the Battle of the Atlantic. It's more of a campaign than it is a battle, multiple battles between the Allies and the Axis at sea. All right, so let's look at the rise of totalitarian Japan. We're looking at the Second Chinese-Japanese War. Sino-Japanese Wars fought from 1937 to 45. This is obviously conflict between Japan and China for control of the Chinese mainland. Do keep in mind that China was in the middle of their own civil war prior to this. Communists led by Mao Zedong, the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek. We made mention previously that the Roosevelt administration and U.S. diplomats were in the camp of the nationalists. There's a pretty interesting Chinese lobby group that was led by the Song family, notably TV Song. Any idea where TV Song went to college? TV Song, the Japanese diplomat that negotiated the American alliance with Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalists. He sure did, and so did his sisters. They were Christianized. Very good school. Yeah. TV Song, the Chinese ambassador, was Harvard educated. His sisters were educated in the South, which is interesting. And that had a lot to do with really his Harvard education had a lot to do with America backing the Czech regime, because much of the cabinet members and advisors that Roosevelt surrounded himself with were Harvard educated. Roosevelt himself, Harvard educated. So the invasion of Manchuria, Mason, good point earlier, after the Manchurian incident, there's not really a large U.S. response to that. There was talk, and Isaiah, you brought this up, there was talk of an embargo, but the Roosevelt administration did not move forward with an embargo following the Manchurian invasion in 1931. The Japanese Kwantung Army, led by General Hideki Tojo, occupies Manchuria, establishes a puppet state by February of 1932, and what this becomes known as is a hidden Holocaust. Civilians on a large scale are going to be murdered, imprisoned, raped. It was horrible the way that the Japanese were treating not only the Manchurians, but also the Chinese. One of the most horrific events is going to be the Japanese invasion of Nanking, which we'll talk a little bit about later. So General Hideki Tojo takes control of the Kwantung. They press China to recognize the independence of their puppet state and suppress anti-Japanese activities, and they wanted to form an autonomous regional government in northern China. This is what pumps the brakes on the Chinese Civil War between Czech's nationalists and Mao's communists. The Japanese were partially successful in 33 through 35 when they forced China to form two DMZs, demilitarized zones, bordering Manchuria. And this is also the era of the restoration of the Japanese Bushido Code. This is the samurai code of honor, discipline, and morality known as the Bushido, the way of the warrior, which is a little ironic because it was supposed to be a chivalrous code of honor, but they did not treat their enemies honorably during these invasions.
Maybe that's because like medieval Japan, it was samurai versus samurai, so they were, like for example, samurai were expected to commit suicide instead of being captured, so like they're like people who weren't, we didn't have that tradition, they were, or maybe it would just be racism, where it's like you're not Japanese, so they're.
I think you're right on both fronts. Yeah. So, 1937, the Japanese army invades China. They have superior weapons. This really bogged down the nationalists during this period of time. The communists, led by Mao, will gain control of large areas through the organization of guerrilla units. This was pretty interesting. The communists and the guerrilla units, they were living in rural mountainous areas in networks of tunnels that the Japanese didn't understand, and they were so far into the interior that they actually put up a pretty solid resistance. This break in the Civil War and an alliance between Mao and Czech from the late 1930s becomes known as the United Front. Here on the top left, this is the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. Top right, this shows you the area of land between Manchuria and China that the Japanese were invading. And then the bottom left and right, you just see the massive destruction that was inflicted upon the Manchurian and Chinese people by the Japanese. July of 1937, soldiers of the Japanese garrison at Beijing and Chinese forces clashed at the Marco Polo Bridge. This was the sort of the beginning of the Japanese invasion of and occupation of Beijing and Tianjin. The United Front fought on, ultimately stalled the Chinese Civil War at least until 1941. Czech refused to negotiate to end the hostilities on Japanese terms and places troops outside of Shanghai. Continued fighting leads to the fall of Shanghai and the nationalist capital at Nanjing. By the end of 1938, Hankou and Guangzhou were taken, so now this gives, are y'all familiar with those two Chinese cities? All right, so this now gives the Japanese a pretty strong hold on the Yangtze River, and it gives them a network of seaports that I believe Michelle brought up earlier is one of their ultimate goals for this invasion. So the strategies of the Japanese here: take the cities, take the roads, control the railroads, control the rivers, and control the ports for a network of control. And by 1940, they will control much of the eastern coastal area, and they begin to take islands controlled by other Pacific nations or colonial landholdings by Western European nations. Between 1940 and the spring of 1942, this will be a large-scale invasion of the Japanese armies throughout islands in the South Pacific and in Indochina. So what hurts the Chinese here? Their resources were inadequate. Supplies are going to be sent over the Burma Road. Somebody out there, I think Davis, you were researching the Burma Road. The Burma Road becomes a network of U.S. aid and supply to China, and it leads to a larger military campaign known as the Burma Campaign. We're actually going to talk, I want to talk to you guys about the Burma Campaign. We had a significant amount of Virginians that served in the Burma Campaign during World War II. Did anybody know, were you guys familiar with the Burma Campaign at all? Well, good. I'm glad we're going to learn about that. I was at a Veterans Day event a couple of years ago, and they had some World War II vets there, and this guy was hilarious. He comes up and he's wearing some of his gear, and he's got his hat on, and he's got a Burma Campaign hat, or pin on his VFW hat. I said, "Oh man, were you in the Burma Campaign?" He said, he said, "Nobody even remembers that." I said, "Oh yeah, we talk about it in class." So I'm glad that we're gonna hit on that, because I want to focus on some of the Virginia units that got pulled into the Burma Campaign. And what's also pretty incredible too is there's this massive airlift for supplies that are going to be going into China as well. And some of the supply and reconnaissance that's done, these flights are going over the Himalayas. It's crazy. Did you ever research any of that?
I do know that there were some flights that were in the Himalayas.
Yeah.
I haven't read too much about them, but I do know it's pretty tough because with piston powered airplanes, they can't go up, the wings don't work above a certain height, and then some of like Mount Everest is 29,000 feet up, so it's, and then it was, yeah, it was really hard to stay happy and being careful because we don't want to end up crashing into the side of the mountain. Also, sometimes it's really slow, so it's kind of really tough life.
Yeah, we're gonna talk about that because it is connected to the Burma Campaign. All right, so within a year, by 1940, this is all the Japanese control. We've got port cities, and then the invasion will continue into 41. And here we're going to discuss the Burma Campaign later in the course, farther in the interior of China. So let's look at the Japanese expansion overview. Japan invades Manchuria for raw materials. The same year, Japan begins to attack China. Full-scale war breaks out in 1937. By 1938, war breaks out between the Japanese and the Soviets along the Soviet-Japanese border. These border wars are going to be fought at the same time as the Japanese are battling the Chinese. So in response to the invasion of China, the United States is going to pass a trade embargo on Japan, mainly oil, petroleum, and some steel. Hirohito, the emperor, who backed the prime minister now, Hideki Tojo, he's appointed prime minister in October of 1941, begins the planning actions against the United States. That'll be the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, Operation Z. Why Pearl Harbor? Why attack there? Naval base. What else?
It was a Sunday, they thought it was, so this would be
Right, they attack on a Sunday. What else does Pearl Harbor provide? Okay. Trade. There's trade coming out of Hawaii, obviously, but there's something else that Pearl Harbor provides for the United States. Kind of. It's a really important, there's like Pearl Harbor, Midway, Wake, Guam, these bases along the Pacific allow for people to get what? As they're making their way to Asia?
Fuel.
Fuel, very good. refueling. And this would give Japan a platform for potential attack on the West Coast. Pearl Harbor is tremendously important, and the protection of Pearl Harbor following the attack is going to be not, well, saying as important as the attack is not really fair, but we need to continue to talk about Hawaii and these Pacific islands that the United States is fighting to maintain control of. The plan here, Japan wants not just the United States, but the globe to accept their predominance in all of the Pacific. So America and the British are going to ultimately provide loans, supplies, establish air bases in China. The Burma Road campaign leads to a supply effort. And a number of U.S. and British advisors are going to help the Chinese, and they are going to back up the nationalist government by Chiang Kai-shek. Does Shek really want a republic? Not necessarily. He's kind of a little bit like a military dictator, but that's who the United States puts its support behind. Here on the left, we have Emperor Hirohito, and on the right, we have now Prime Minister Hideki Tojo. So, the Anti-Comintern Pact, the Nazi-Japanese Treaty, was signed on November 25th, 1936, between the Nazis and the Japanese. This alliance will ultimately prove disastrous for Germany in terms of loyalty. Germany will be forced to declare war on the United States following the attack on Pearl Harbor and Roosevelt's declaration of war on Japan the following day, December 8th, 1941. Here we have Musha Koji on the right, and we have Ribbentrop on the right. These are the foreign ministers signing the Nazi-Japanese treaty. And then we're going to wrap up with the Spanish Civil War. So, Spanish Civil War is fought between 1936 and 1939. It's a conflict that is pretty complex. There are conservative and traditionalist forces in Spain that are going to rise up to attempt to overthrow the Second Spanish Republic. Do keep in mind there is a communist movement in Spain. There's also an anarchist movement in Spain at this period of time. Spain was hit really hard by the Great Depression. In July of '36, Generalissimo Francisco Franco led an army revolt in Morocco, and he will ultimately back the Spanish nationalists, but he himself is not interested in a democratic style of government. He's going to actually rule as a military dictator until his death. Franco signs a treaty with Italy and Germany that will ultimately pull in planes, tanks, and other materials. 10,000 members of the Luftwaffe, a number of panzers, and this is going to turn the tide of the battle in favor of Franco. Not to mention the fact the Nazis are going to not only just drop in with assaults by, Stukas and other planes, but they're also going to do troop transport. So they move a lot of the Spanish soldiers by air. So what this leads to is Britain and France propose a non-intervention pact, which is going to be signed in August of 1936 by 27 nations. But by April 1st, 1939, the victorious nationalists will enter Madrid under Franco's military dictatorship. Italy and Germany recognized the Franco regime in 1936. England and France didn't get involved. And really, this is one more example of what? Appeasement. Very good. Awesome job. So this is sort of a testing ground for the Blitzkrieg and other techniques, especially for the Luftwaffe and the Panzer units that were led by Rommel. European democracies, especially those that were part of the League, are just seen as the scene as one more example of unnecessary appeasement. On the left, we have Francisco Franco, Generalissimo, and on the right, this just shows you the block-to-block, street-to-street fighting in major Spanish cities. These folks are using horses as a barrier to fight in the streets. I'm not sure if that particular picture was taken in Madrid or not. I'd have to take a look. Yeah. They're fighting with anything they can get their hands on. Yeah. And a lot of the fighting was actually hand-to-hand combat. They had like homemade incendiary bombs, like Molotov cocktail type bombs. I mean, it was, and what made the fighting difficult is that there were different factions fighting against one another during the Civil War. It was not like a real united front within this particular 3-year Civil War. So we have a little bit of a timeline of what we've covered here. We talked about the Anschluss, the reoccupation of Austria by Germany, the agreement that was broken, the Munich Agreement, or the Munich Pact, after between the British and Hitler. Hitler invades Czechoslovakia, but everyone allows that to take place. They'll renegotiate the Munich Pact, and that Munich Pact will be sort of peace in our time, that this will be the last appeasement provided for Hitler. But starting on September 1st, 1939, Hitler invades Poland, and on September 3rd, Britain and France will declare war. Just out of sight there, the period, we're actually going to talk about this moving forward, the period of September to May of 1940, September of 39 to May of 1940 is called the Phony War, because Britain and France did little to mobilize to get on the side of Poland. And what people did understand is that the Nazis were planning for invasions, and those invasions will come in the spring of 40. The invasion of Denmark, the invasion of Norway, the invasion of the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and ultimately France. So we'll be talking about that moving forward. We got some propaganda here on the left. This is propaganda of the Battle of Britain, London burning. On the top, or over there on the right, these are Nazis and Italian black shirts coming together. Top left, Churchill and Roosevelt. And then we have some Italian and Nazi propaganda on the right. This child's head's on fire, and we've got the Soviet, the Jewish, and the Freemason grabbing at the child. And then we have a map of Hitler's partners in the war. Japan, we've discussed today, and Spain. We already talked about Italy. And then what we're going to do moving forward is we are going to go from Europe to Asia, to North Africa, back to Europe, back to Asia. I am going to throw the home front in, and I'm going to throw leaders in the middle of that to try to break up a lot of the key battles. All right. You guys have any questions? Okay, so